So, very good. Are you okay with this sharing? You're all set, Ellen?
Yeah.
Good.
So I take it that everybody's hearing what we say. We shouldn't say anything that we don't want them to hear.
Yeah, we've been live streaming on Facebook for like 5 minutes, so hopefully you already knew that.
So
Let's see.
letting
Okay.
everybody in.
All right,
Everybody.
great. Wonderful.
Hello, letting everybody in.
Wonderful. Wow, look at that. No, nice. All right. All right, very good. Well, according to this clock, we've got 25 seconds until we start. So just hang tight. We'll get there. Of course, people coming in, and we'll give them a minute to sit down, organize their coffee or whatever it is that's near the chair, and we'll take it from there.
Hey,
And what would they have other than coffee? Really?
That's really
Hi.
their business. All right.
hi, John.
All right.
Stephen. Hey, Michael. Hello.
Yes, if that Stephen is for me, hello.
Yeah. Hello. Hello.
Hello.
I'm visiting. I'm with the American Monetary Institute, but
Oh, wonderful.
we have overlapping problems in getting government to be thought of in good ways by the citizenry often, and I think maybe we should work together so that we don't debunk government so badly. And the word public is a good word.
Yes.
You're absolutely right. Well, listen, folks, it's time, and we'll let people come in as they do. So welcome, one and all. We are absolutely delighted to have the opportunity to meet with you tonight to discuss a core civic responsibility and opportunity: the management and the preservation of community monetary resources, and the role that a public bank on the state, municipal, and regional levels can play. More importantly, we want to address why this matter deserves your prioritized attention and to move you to action. So hello, I'm Walt McCree, Chair Emeritus and Senior Advisor to the Public Banking Institute. I've been asked to anchor this event tonight, and have been involved with the development of public banking initiatives around the country for over the past decade or so. I've had the pleasure of working with many of you here in Colorado during that time. Tonight, my colleagues and the notable figurehead of the public banking movement, Ellen Brown, will be presenting an overview of public banking and its urgent relevance. We'll also be hearing from several of the stalwart Colorado-based public banking leaders, including attorney Earl Staelin, Professor Alec Tsoucatos, Michael Melio, who initiated this meeting, and a number of other local team supporters, including Tessa Robertson, Elizabeth Lane, and others who've been working with Colorado groups that include the Rocky Mountain Public Banking Institute, 350 Colorado, Colorado Public Banking Coalition, and of course the Public Banking Institute, with PBI's own Kimbria Bodenhausen, who has helped to bring this evening's technology together, and you'll be hearing from her in just a moment. We'll be meeting for about 90 minutes, and there will be time afterward for questions after presentations, so we hear from the key presenters. But before we begin, I want to hand things over to Kimbria to tell you how to participate in tonight's meeting, where the levers are for operating questions and getting answers, etc. How to take advantage of the chat resources that will be going on as we proceed. So Kimbria, tell us about it.
Thank you, Walt. And I'll ask Tessa to keep track of admitting people while I'm giving these instructions. So welcome, everyone. Great to see all your smiling faces. This presentation is being recorded and streamed on Facebook. If you'd like to remain off the camera, please turn your camera off, and then you will not be included in the recording or the live stream. We would like to see your faces though, so if you are having bandwidth issues, turning off your camera will help, but if you can, please leave it on. For those of you calling in on the telephone, if there is anyone, you want to press *9 to raise your hand. And once you're recognized, Then please press *6 to unmute yourself. If you are with us online, you can raise your hand so we can answer your questions in order. You can find the raise hand function by clicking on reactions. If at any time you need any help with any of these instructions, you can chat with me either directly or behind the scenes, and I'll be happy to answer your questions. We also have my colleague Suzanne O'Keefe, who is here to answer questions in the chat. And we have a senior advisor, Scott Baker, who is also on. Scott knows a lot about financial stuff. So if he sees something, a question that he recognizes, I believe he will be happy to answer that also. At the end of the meeting, you will be able to save the chat by opening the chat window and clicking on the 3 dots. At the end of the meeting, after your camera's turned off, you've closed the window, a new folder will open with the chat transcript visible. The transcript will have all the entries that appeared after you entered the meeting. So we're holding off on entering some information now until a greater number of people come on. Anything that is visible after you entered the meeting will be in that saved folder. Thank you very much, Walt. I'm handing it back to you.
Okay, Kibria, thank you very much. I'd like to begin our discussion tonight with a few brief contextual remarks about why public banks, which are publicly owned, publicly dedicated, and publicly accountable financial institutions, represent a transformative systemic breakthrough for cities, counties, and states, and why they are uniquely qualified to address another widely impactful systemic issue: the annual extraction of hundreds of millions of Colorado taxpayer dollars and hundreds of billions of dollars from citizens all around the country, which result in debt-strapped communities which needlessly struggle to achieve a solid economic footing at a time of dramatically changing financial inequities, and which undermine the power and promise of future democratic governance. My primary purpose right now is to get you to see that our current system of governmental fiscal management is systemically limited and diminished by the power of private capital interests. And that because these private interests control our money for their own interests, the public's interests languish. The public banking movement creates the opportunity for a new awareness, which recognizes the truth that the public's monetary power has been abrogated to private money interests, and that these moneyed interests undermine the democratic power of the people. So put simply, public banking is about keeping our money at home to invest in ourselves. And now that is the kind of irrefutable common sense logic which makes many of the people who first hear about public banking say, hey, why don't we have that now? And the answer is that right now, your tax dollars are likely held in large, probably global banking companies with headquarters that are not in Colorado. These big banks and their associated agents have their hands in our pension funds. They control the bond markets and the amount of what we pay for our money, on which our governments rely for investment dollars, and which we must remember brought down the global economy not so many years ago, forcing millions of citizens out of their jobs and their homes, while the bank brass retained outsized and unearned annual bonuses. And because these titanic monetary interests have such enormous influence in our government and media, they manage to conceal and overrule public will and public accountability. Several of you here tonight have been privileged to serve the public through government appointment and public election, and we're grateful for your attendance in this discussion. While each of us realizes that government of, by, and for the people cannot thrive if heavy-handed financial interests overwhelm public agendas and public policy. So it's with elected officials at this moment that this historic opportunity now rests to make some fundamental distinctions and determinations about our financial infrastructure and our financial future. The ubiquitous nature of large Wall Street-based capital interests are burrowing deeper and deeper into our civic body on all levels as parasites, feeding on the debt that we've been obliged to acquire in order to finance our needs and aspirations. Public banks are the distinction that we want to make for you tonight. Instituting public banks is the determination we want you to make. In essence, it's about local power, local control, and local benefits. Cities and states around the country are realizing that unending indebtedness to private parties is no recipe for a sustainable, affordable future economy. Only by keeping our money at home under the watchful eye of local guardians and local guidance will we be able to plan and afford a future worthy of our affection, as one of our enlightened economists says it. From Massachusetts to California, dozens of public banking initiatives are underway, and they are inspiring local communities to begin new planning exercises for how they will implement the exciting community projects of the future, ones in which affordable housing is created and kept permanently affordable, one in which infrastructure costs are halved by self-financing, and where local small businesses and minority businesses and community banks find new abilities to collaborate. On that last note, let me just assure those of you who are just learning about public banking that we support very strongly local commercial lenders. We're not against banks. We support local lenders and credit unions, and we aggressively stand for their importance as primary credit utilities that help propel the health and the wealth of local economies. We don't hate banks. In fact, we think they're pretty clever and essential public utilities that should be operated in the public interest. But we do draw the line at those global banks that speculate with our money rather than invest it here at home, and which through their ongoing connivance and influence have hampered our civic engines with usurious debt. So, welcome to this discussion, and we look forward to fielding your questions later as we proceed. Now, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce my dear friend and colleague who got this national movement underway over 10 years ago with the publishing of a best-selling book called The Web of Debt, which for many of us was a wake-up call. We never noticed that we were caught in such a racket. Ellen Brown has written also 2 other books, actually quite a number of other books, but The Public Banking Solution and Banking on the People are her most recent ones. And Ellen is the chair of the Public Banking Institute. So with that, here's Ellen Brown.
Thanks, Walt. I went to high school in Littleton, Colorado, so it's great to see everybody. It warms my heart. Okay. Get this right. Oops. Slideshow. All right. Sorry. Okay, as Walt says, we're talking about local control, local power, and local benefits, the power of public banking. As we all know, our local economies are in crisis. In 2020, lockdowns forced 200,000 more US businesses to close their doors than in normal years. And it's the local businesses that are responsible for our local production. It's where most of our local employment comes from. Local governments and the businesses that survived continue to struggle for affordable credit. Critical business, social, and infrastructure needs remain unmet. Eric Hardimeyer was the former CEO of the Bank of North Dakota, and he was in a recent webinar where he said, instead of backing away from a crisis, we run to a crisis. That is what makes us different. We are a first responder, not a profiteer. He also said, in a crisis, private banks are scared to death to lend. On the flames of an economic crisis, the water is affordable credit. The way to, I gotta get these pictures out of the way. The way to stimulate a flagging economy is with affordable credit. So what I will say in this presentation basically is that money enters our economy not from federal money printing, as most people think, but from bank loans. Local economies are not awash with money, as most people think. I mean, it's not too much money floating around in the economy that's driving inflation. It's too few goods. Or shortages. We're actually short of money. Public banks can make affordable loans when private banks won't. And a local government can solve its budget problems and get money into its local economy by borrowing cheaply from its own bank. The money we spend is not created by government. It's created by commercial banks when they make loans. So said the Bank of England in their quarterly report in 2014. They said, contrary to popular belief, banks are not merely intermediaries taking in deposits and lending the money out again. In fact, commercial banks create money in the form of bank deposits by making new loans. In fact, they said bank deposits make up 97% of the amount of money currently in circulation. And you can see that from this chart on the right. The red is the money created by banks, and the green is the cash created by the Federal Reserve. So what about quantitative easing? People will say, you know, that did look like it made the money supply go up, but what the Fed creates is not the money in circulation. The Fed only creates bank reserves. They cannot leave the balance sheets of banks. They can move from one bank to another, but they don't go out into the real economy. In order for them to get into the real economy, the bank has to lend. Quantitative easing is just an asset swap. So what the Fed would do is buy either some form of security, usually a federal security or mortgage-backed security. They buy it from a bank. The bank will then have bank reserves, and the Fed will have the asset. But the bank reserves, the banks already had plenty of reserves after the last big bailout. So they don't need more reserves, and that doesn't really help them lend. What they need is, or what we need is affordable credit so that borrowers can take out these loans. How banks create money is with double entry bookkeeping. This goes back hundreds of years. So if you go to the bank and take out a $500,000 home loan, you will sign a mortgage, which is your promissory note to pay that money back with interest. So the bank writes that as an asset on one side of its books, and then it will write that same sum into your account for $500,000. You now have that in the form of deposits. So they have just created $500,000 in deposits. And they will say, well, we haven't created anything. The net result is 500 plus, 500 minus, net result is 0. But when that when you write a check to your seller, if the seller is, the seller of the house you want to buy, if the seller is in another bank, that check will go into the other bank and will become a new $500,000 deposit, adding to the deposits that are counted in the M2 money supply. And let's say that bank does the same thing and creates a $500,000 loan, which becomes a deposit, which finds its way into Bank A. So both banks will have 500 coming in, 500 going out, their books will balance, but $1 million in the form of deposits will have been created that didn't exist before. And that's where the bulk of our money supply comes from. This system goes back to the goldsmiths of the 17th century who became bankers. They would take people's gold for safekeeping and write promissory notes for the gold. And they quickly discovered that people preferred the promissory notes for trading over the gold because they were safer and easier to carry around. So they only came for their gold about 10% of the time, which meant the banks could lend out 10 times as many notes as they actually had gold. And that's the basis of the 10% reserve requirement that we had right up until recently, although now the Federal Reserve has eliminated the reserve requirement altogether, but that is what was called fractional reserve banking. In the US, or in the American colonies before we were the US, the colonies really didn't have money. They didn't have gold, and it's not like you had a bank on every corner like we do now. So the farmers and small businesses couldn't get credit. And so not much was happening in the way of development. until Massachusetts got the clever idea of issuing paper scrip, which were supposedly advances against future taxes. So they would issue this scrip that represented acknowledging goods and services that had been delivered to the government, local government, and backed by the full faith and credit of the people. The people acknowledged that those sums were owed, and they traded in the marketplace for value. But the problem was that it was a lot easier to issue this paper scrip than to pull it back in taxes. So they did tend to hyperinflate the money supply and devalue the currency. So Pennsylvania got the clever idea of forming a bank. They called it a land bank, although they didn't actually foreclose on any farms, apparently. But what they did was they also issued paper scrip, but they lent it to the farmers at 5% interest. So the money would go out and the money would come back. So the books would balance. And then when we became a country, Alexander Hamilton was our first Treasury Secretary and set up the first US bank, which was operated on the fractional reserve system. So it issued 10 times as many notes in the form of credit or deposits as it had gold in the vaults. And particularly the second US bank was all about production, that those loans were all for productive purposes, most notably the Erie Canal. And then during the 19th century, we did have some state-owned banks, but none of them was as viable as the Bank of North Dakota, formed in the 20th century. So in the 20th century, in the 1930s, of course, we had a banking crisis and people didn't trust the banks. They were going bankrupt right and left. So people pulled their money out of the private banks and they put it in the postal banks, which were set up in 1912. They paid 2% interest. It was very convenient. They had better hours than bankers' hours. You could do your postal banking in one window or do your banking in one window and you get your mail in another window. And we also, during the 1930s, had the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which was not technically a bank, but it operated as a bank. It was a public institution, and it basically funded the New Deal and much of World War II. And by the time it closed down, was closed down by a Republican government under Eisenhower, 25 years later, it had done all that and generated a profit for the government. So it basically rebuilt the country, funded a war, and still turned a profit for the government. And then we have the Bank of North Dakota, which was formed in 1919 and established the standard for state-owned banks. It's actually our only state-owned bank. So we only have that one bank, but around the world, public banking has been going strong for a long time, before we actually did it, notably the Sparkassen banks in Germany, the Chinese banks, which are the largest public banks in the world. Many countries have banks globally. 17% of banks are publicly owned and 25% of banking assets are publicly owned. So when we say public bank, you might think public bank, well, that's a public corporation listed on the stock market, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a bank owned by the residents of a local government. So a city, state, region, territory, or nation. It can, but doesn't necessarily have to, hold the deposits of government, such as taxes and fees. It is transparent, it's subject to public oversight, it has a mission to serve the public good, reflects the values and needs of its community, invests in the local community, and its bank profits benefit the public, not private shareholders. So our one and only bank, the Bank of North Dakota. We also have the Bank of American Samoa, but that's a territory, so it's not really a state and it's brand new. The Bank of North Dakota, I started writing about it in 2009 because I knew it was the only state that had its own bank. So I was watching North Dakota, and it turned out it was the only state that never went into the red during that crisis. It had the nation's lowest unemployment rate, the lowest default rate, the most local banks per capita. And in 2014, the Wall Street Journal published an article that said the Bank of North Dakota was actually more profitable than Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan Chase. How did they do that? That article said it was oil, but in fact, the oil market collapsed that year. And the North Dakota tapped the Bank of North Dakota for an extra dividend in order to balance their budget to get out of this crisis. So the Bank of North Dakota has reported record profits year after year, right up until, I guess, last year. It was the same profits as the previous year, but it's something like 20% return on in equity, I think, or return on investment. I'm sorry, Earl, correct me on that, over the last decade.
Equity.
Sorry?
Equity.
Equity, okay, return on equity. I see that we had a chart wrong. So why was it so profitable? It was its business model. It doesn't have private shareholders. It doesn't pay bonuses, fees, or commissions. It doesn't have high paid executives. It doesn't have to advertise. It has a massive deposit base. By law, all of the state's revenues are deposited in the bank, and it doesn't have to advertise for borrowers. It partners with the local bank. So the local bank actually finds the borrowers, deals with the customers, and it's the local bank that turns to the Bank of North Dakota if it needs some help. Like if there's a loan that's too big for the local bank, which would have gone to a Wall Street bank, the local bank can keep the customer, and the Bank of North Dakota will bar down a portion of the loan, maybe 90% of the loan. But still the local bank gets to keep the client, and it doesn't need, the Bank of North Dakota doesn't need branches or ATMs, and savings are passed on to the community. So that's what they do in North Dakota, but most states are put their funds in big out-of-state mega banks, usually Wall Street banks. The problem with this model is that those banks put private profits ahead of public interest. They siphon money out of the state. They're not creating new money for the state, but for somewhere else. Legally, the bank owns the money. The lender are just a creditor. And so they can do as they will with that money, including engaging in risky speculative practices, which we know they've done quite a bit of. They've admitted to major felonies and paid some pretty major fines. They emphasize fees over loans, drying up local credit, and they prefer loans for things like houses, which they're not producing anything new. It's money competing for existing assets, which drives up the price of those assets. So it creates bubbles, which inevitably lead to busts. It also drives out local banks, leaving banking deserts where there just is no place for the local people to bank. And for loans, most governments borrow from the private bond market. And this is a quite risky, expensive practice. Interest and fees can be half the cost of infrastructure. Infrastructure bonds are typically like 30 years, just like a 30-year mortgage, which means, as we know, a 30-year mortgage, like half of it can be interest. Here, one example is the Bay Bridge retrofit in San Francisco. The taxpayers were told that it was a $6 billion bond, but by the time they paid off the interest, it was a $12 billion bond. In 2020, nationally, local governments paid $160 billion just in interest. And Denver, the city of Denver, paid $277 million in interest that same year, and it had a budget deficit of $226 million. So if it could have recovered all that interest money, it would have had no budget deficit. Of course, there's some costs in running a bank, but the point is that that it would have made a big, it would have helped the budget deficit substantially. Fees go to Wall Street banks and profits go to wealthy private bondholders. So that means money is typically going out of state. You're not generating new money for your local economy. And bonds are exempt from state taxes. So that means you're not getting tax revenues for the local economy. And underwriting itself can be quite expensive. According to Moody's rating agency, municipal bond default rate between 1970 and 2020 was essentially 0.08%. Like the reason they don't default is that cities have a tax base. And yet they have to go through this quite costly and involved certification process in order to qualify the bonds for investors. And the bond underwriters are big banks, which get the fees and the compensation for sales to investors. They've been caught in collusion, bid rigging, and bad swap advice. And they have paid nearly $2 billion in fines and fees just since 2000. So as an alternative, local governments actually are allowed to borrow directly from banks. And some governments have been doing that. Per Moody's, 20% of new municipal borrowings are direct bank loans. They do this because the interest rates can be lower. There are fewer regulatory hurdles and lower transaction costs. They don't have to pay fees for rating agencies, credit enhancements, bond trustees, and their attorneys. They don't need to go to the voters for approval. And a loan from a bank is actually creating new money as credit for the local economy, unlike bonds where you're just recirculating old money. So why don't local governments do that more than 20% of the time? Well, basically banks are reluctant to make these large long-term loans. You typically need like a 30-year or a long loan for infrastructure. And the banks don't want to commit to a particular interest rate. Like right now, when rates are low, rates might go up and the bank will be losing money. So instead, what bonds do is they shift that risk to the local government or to the borrower. And what has happened is that the banks have sold these interest rate swaps to local governments. From 2009 to 2015, $500 billion was paid in interest rate swaps at a time when local governments had more than $600 billion in budget deficits. So it's not that the whole budget deficit was due to interest rate swaps, but they turned out to be a very bad deal. They were sold as insurance. So what happened was that the bond would be at a variable interest rate. And so to avoid the rate going up or to protect it against a higher rate, the bank would take on the variable rate and give the local government a fixed rate. And what happened was that rates went down, down, down. And so the local governments lost money. They weren't making money, for example, in their pension funds. They're making almost nothing because interest rates are so low. So they were stuck with these very high rates, relatively high rates on their bonds. And it was very expensive to get out of these deals. So what is the alternative? Borrow from your own bank, form your own public bank. A public bank can lend at cost, doesn't have to worry about shareholders demanding short-term profits. Public banks can make short-term loans and roll them over, so you don't have to worry about default risk because you are the borrower. You know you're not going to default, or you're backed by taxes. And for liquidity, ideally, the bank would do what the Bank of North Dakota does, or what North Dakota does, and require all of the state's revenues to be deposited in the bank. But legislators seem to be hesitant to commit to that, as we've discovered over the last decade, trying to get banks set up. So instead, you can do what the big Wall Street banks do for liquidity. If you have a little shortage on liquidity, you can borrow short-term, I think up to 3 months, from the Fed discount window at 0.5%. And the Fed will roll those over. So they say, I don't know, there might be some limit at some point that they may quit rolling them over. Or you can borrow in the repo market overnight, or 2-week loans, short-term loans, as banks typically do, or from the Federal Home Loan Bank. And in both the repo market and the Federal Home Loan Bank, I looked that up, somebody could correct me on that, but it looks to be like municipal loans, the loan itself is acceptable as collateral for those loans. And a public bank can buy its own municipal bonds or refinance old ones. And if they do that, you are again borrowing from a bank, which is creating money as deposits on its books. So you're creating new money for the local economy. Public banks are also preferred in a crisis because they lend countercyclically, as you can see in this chart, meaning in a crisis, private banks are afraid to lend. So they're pulling back their loans. That's the blue on the left-hand side of this chart. And the public banks jump in and they make more loans. They can lend to qualifying local businesses at cost. They don't have to worry about profits for their shareholders. In other words, unlike municipal revolving loan funds, which most local banks do have, they can leverage their capital at 10 to 1. So let's say you had a revolving fund. If you had, say you had $1 million in your revolving fund, you could lend that out at 3%. And at the end of the year, you would have 3%. But if you use that $1 million to capitalize a bank or capitalize your loans, you could lend $10 million. And so you could make 30%. Of course, you have costs on in both cases, but the point is you can make a lot more money as a bank than as a revolving fund, and you can get a lot more credit out there into the economy, affordable credit for local businesses. Public banks lender in crisis, said that already. Okay, for depositors, public banks are inclusive, meaning that they can bank the unbanked and underbanked, which we have a problem with. For example, the postal banks in the 1930s, and they're safer in downturns for depositors. They also, well, we only have the Bank of North Dakota as an example, but they also are faster and better responders in an economic crisis. In the COVID crisis, North Dakota distributed unemployment benefits 10 times faster than the slowest state through community banks coordinated by the Bank of North Dakota. Small businesses in North Dakota secured more payroll protection program loans per worker than any other state, or sorry, funds than any other state. And the Bank of North Dakota coordinated all that and educated local bankers and had it all set up before that program was even launched. Public banking is on the move in the US. 18 new public banking bills were actually introduced in 2021 in 8 states. 30 of 50 states have proposed public banking bills in the last 12 years since we've been working on it. And over 50 organizations nationwide are promoting public banks. So in summary, why do we need our own banks? Banks, not the Fed or the Treasury, create our money supply. Thus, bank loans, unlike bonds, inject new money into circulation. Banks, unlike municipal revolving loan funds, can leverage their capital at 10 to 1. Banks, unlike local governments, can borrow from the Fed's discount window at 0.5%. It used to be 0.25%, but it went up this year. Public banks can operate at cost and have a mandate to serve the people and local economy. And states and cities can finally meet critical local business, social, and infrastructure needs. And these are our websites, publicbankinginstitute.org. We have a ton of resources there for information. My website is ellenbrown.com, where I have hundreds of articles that I've written on the subject, and those are my 3 books on the subject. Thank you very much.
Wow.
Wow.
Thanks, Ellen. That's terrific. There's just so much that you can see to talk about. It's such a fascinating field. Banking itself is pretty fascinating, but municipal and state government finance is akin to that. And the opportunities that public banks bring into the flexibility and the availability and the affordability of public money for public investment is extraordinary. So thanks, Ellen. I appreciate that. We're really fortunate to have Ellen and really the resolute dedication of so many others around the country who are working to help bring this transformational change into our public finance infrastructure. And one of those people is our colleague and your neighbor, Michael Melio, the secretary of the Rocky Mountain Public Banking Institute and an IT professional with a long history of public service. Michael?
Thank you, Walt, and thank you, Ellen, for that rather extensive and beautiful presentation you made. I'm going to kind of step it down a little bit and start with a much more simple model of what's happening with our taxes. So if you can see my screen, can you see the private versus public banking models, anyone?
It looks good, Michael.
Okay, thank you. And my profession is one of a database professional and data modeler. So what I wanted to do was understand what happens when we pay taxes and how that money flows. So I have before us now the private versus public banking models for depositing and investing tax revenue. And it's a simple but yet poignant illustration that I hope you will appreciate by the end of it. Have you ever wondered what happened to the sales taxes that you pay to your city, the property taxes you pay to your county, the income taxes and fees that you pay to your state governments? Where does it go? How is it distributed? And for the benefit of whom? This presentation will answer those essential questions. There are two general models that define the flow of money when you pay taxes to your governments, local, county, state, and national. And these are the private banking model and the public banking model. By far, the for-profit banking model the banking system is the dominant model, controlling more than 97% of the credit markets in this country. In fact, there's only one public bank in the United States, as Ellen pointed out, that's the State Bank of North Dakota. So looking at the screen, you will see that our pardon me, let's go, I'll get it right. That our labor produces money and income for our families, etc. And part of this money is paid in taxes to our governments, in fees and taxes. And for illustration purposes, we will use this city government in this presentation, but the two models apply equally to all levels of government: city, county, state, and national. The city then deposits our money into a bank. And as Alan pointed out, what is a deposit? And here's the legal truth. Whenever you or a government deposits money in a bank, a transfer of ownership occurs. That's right. Legally, a deposit is really a loan to the bank. And once the loan is issued, that is when a deposit is made, the bank now becomes the new legal owner of that money and free to do with it as they see fit. And the depositor or loaner becomes just another creditor of the bank and wait in line when the bank goes under for your payback. Next slide. Oops, sorry. Next sequence. So deposits are a loan and collateral is required because additionally, more than 99% of the taxes you pay to the government are being deposited in privately owned mega banks, most of which operate from Wall Street. You know their names: JP Morgan Chase, Citigroup, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Goldman Sachs, and about a dozen other privately owned banks. The top 4 private banks in the USA have combined assets of over $8.7 trillion. And I keep doing that. I keep hitting the wrong thing here. So, and here you can see the top 4 banks, and their total assets are well over $8.7 trillion. Collateral is required by these private banks because they are not the original owners of the money on deposit with them. So it must be backed by the assets of the bank. All right. Oh, geez, sorry, I keep doing the wrong thing. So you would not be remiss to ask at this point, why are our governments depositing taxpayer wealth into privately owned Wall Street banks? I'd like to know why, wouldn't you? Of course, no mayor, no city councilor, no county commissioner, and no state legislator alive today is responsible for the creation of this private banking system. And what is the role of banks in the economy? What is it that banks actually do? Professor Richard Werner, international banking expert, has summarized the views of banking in three theories: the intermediation theory of banking, the fractional reserve theory of banking, which Ellen touched on, and the credit creation theory. To summarize his study, he discovered that by empirical analysis, that banks are the creators of the money supply whenever they issue a loan. To continue, so how are these too big to fail banks investing our taxes? The largest mega banks prefer to invest in the largest corporations, providing billions of dollars for investments in armaments and war industries, for oil, gas, and other fossil fuel corporations, for petrochemical giants and plastic manufacturers that are all polluting our air, water, and land, and for investments in the speculative financial instruments responsible for the asset bubbles that crippled the economy in 2008, threatening to do so again. But alas, the only real beneficiaries of this private banking system are the mega banks that are getting all your tax money, reaping huge volumes in profits while taking none of the risks for their gambling habits. This private monopoly on banking represents a triple theft of the tax-paying public. First, the wealth of the taxpayer is extracted from their community and awarded to private monopoly banks by our governments whenever they deposit our wealth in their banks. The second theft occurs whenever a citizen or government requires a loan. They are charged usurious interest rates that further extract wealth from the public. The third theft of the tax-paying public occurs when the big banks go bust and cannot pay their creditors. The taxpayer is once again called upon to bail them out or bail them in. The now all too familiar boom and bust cycles of the economy is testament to the failings of this private monopoly banking system. In contrast, we have the public banking model. Naturally, this leads us to ask the question, is there a better way? And yes, indeed there is. And I am here today to gladly report to you that there is the well-established paradigm of public banking with a rich history of banking for the public good. So to be brief, once our labor creates money, some of our money is paid in taxes to our governments, and but instead of depositing our tax money into privately owned banks that serve their own interests, our tax money is deposited in a city public bank, a bank owned by the tax-paying community. And no collateral is required for the bank because the depositor and the bank are the same owners. The city owns the city bank is owned by the city, the county bank is owned by the county, and the state bank is owned by the state. And like all banks, the public bank possesses the powers of credit creation represented here by the money tree. But unlike the private banks, which only extract money from your community, public banks are chartered and missioned to reinvest our tax money into the tax community, multiplying our taxes many times and providing no cost or very low cost loans to the local government. With all the necessary financing readily available from its own public bank, good governments will address the many needs of its citizens, providing ample money for infrastructure improvements, refinancing government debt, assisting small and medium-sized local businesses, providing affordable housing and home loans, financing student loans and the education system, making healthcare more affordable, transitioning away from dirty fossil fuels to cleaner energy sources, providing inexpensive broadband, helping build more sustainable agriculture, and much, much more. Governed by the regional principle that constrains investments to the local jurisdiction, city, county, and state public banks can provide ample lines of credit to the local community for businesses and other for-profit and not-for-profit enterprises. The end result of this public banking system can be summed up in several points. The tax wealth of the tax community is kept in the community. The tax wealth of the tax community is multiplied many times and leveraged for the good of the community that the bank is chartered to serve. The total community wealth is increased with each loan issued by the bank. And perhaps most importantly, and this is the major point of this presentation, this public banking system of reinvesting in the community creates a dynamic loop that funnels and multiplies community wealth back into the community. It creates an economic engine with a feedback loop of public wealth. The evidence of this economic dynamo can best be seen in the highly productive German economy, whose exports are second in the world, lagging only China. Yet China has 20 times the population of Germany. The community savings banks and Sparkassen banks of Germany services numerous communities throughout the country, making Germany the largest source of hidden champions, as Professor Werner calls them, small and medium-sized businesses that are highly effective and efficient, dominating the global export markets. To summarize, the present system of a private banking cartel receiving the wealth of taxpayer money is not only failing our cities, counties, and states, but is seriously driving the climate crisis and the related sixth mass extinction event currently undergoing. But no politician today is responsible for the creation of this system of perpetual debt. But let's be perfectly clear. Every politician today has a decision to make. Will you continue this theft of your constituents, or will you champion a public bank for your community and break this bondage of debt and move your city, county, and state toward the greener pastures of sustainable local development? The choice is yours to make. Please do the right thing. Thank you very much. And with that, I would like to introduce my friend, colleague, and fellow board member on the Rocky Mountain Public Banking Institute, Professor and economist, Alec Tsoucatos.
Thank you, Michael. Contessa, can you show me the first slide, please?
Yeah, I'm pulling it up now for you.
Yes. The first slide up above, yeah. So money as a public utility, its effects on public banking. I chose, with the consent of my colleagues, to speak about a public bank as equivalent to a public utility. Next. So by definition, a public utility is meant to supply goods and services that are essential for everybody. They don't depend on the market information, but they depend by and large of what is needed for the general population to be safe, to be healthy, and indeed, to the extent possible, to be thriving. What are the tools, the economic tools that we need in order to live a good life? Next. So money as a public utility is primarily, today, however, it is produced by private institutions named banks, as my previous colleagues analyzed very convincingly, and operate for the benefit of the owners of these banks. They loan out money and they do that for their own benefit. In contrast, in a sovereign state, that is to say, a federal state that produces its own currency and is not dependent for its money to other governments, money can be produced by the federal government instead of private banks and distributed so as to benefit the common good. This is a real possibility for all sovereign countries. It's been established that that is the case. It doesn't mean that it doesn't have issues or sensitivities, but nevertheless, that is a true statement, as surely as the world is round rather than flat. And the federal government can create as much money as it wants to. That doesn't mean that it will, because there are dangers to creating, quote, too much money, because it can go into inflation. But nevertheless, it has the capacity to do that. And therefore, nobody can say on the federal level, we don't have enough money to do whatever it is that people propose. The only limitation to us doing things that are good for the public is the resources, the physical, natural resources, and the labor resources, and the capital resources that we have, not the money. So money need not ever be scarce for a federal government. Now, next. For states and municipalities and cities, money can be created by public banks, as was mentioned earlier, by creating debt, just as with private banks, but with two crucial differences. So a public bank in a city cannot create as much money as it wants to. It is confined by the amount of capital that it has and also the amount of deposits. But there are two crucial differences between a private bank and a public bank on the state, municipal, and city level. And that is that the loans that are made are there to further the public good, and on the one side, and the profits that are made by this bank are returned to the state or the municipality or the city. So that essentially only the public is benefited. Or by public, I mean we the people. Next. Now, I chose this analogy with national parks because of my concern that has been directed towards me about, oh, so here you are again suggesting that instead of leaving things to be done by private individuals and private businesses and private corporations, you want the government to now do it, since the government is going to be owning the public bank, as the name implies, rather than individuals or corporations. So there you are, as President Reagan would say, you think that the government is the solution, but indeed, as he claimed, the government is the problem. So I wanted to attend to that accusation. And the reason I chose national parks is because although the national parks are owned by the government, by the federal government, and regulated and policed, as it were, by an agency of the federal government, it's still the case that the how shall I say, the way that they are dealt with by people who govern the national parks are entrusted to do so not for any government interest and not for any corporate interest, that even though it's owned by the government doesn't benefit from the use of the public parks. It is the people of the United States that benefit. And that's why it's been called the greatest idea to have public parks. So you're not subservient either to individual or corporate interest or to government or politicians' interests who might want to use the fact that the government owns things in order to take advantage and benefit themselves. So that's the case with a public bank, that the public bank, even though owned by a government, is protected against both corporate interests and also political interests, so that their influence and their practice can benefit only the public good. Next. And as others have said, I just made a list as well, that there are public banks that exist and thrive throughout the world. It's not only in North Dakota, it's not only in Germany, but also in Argentina, also in Costa Rica, also in Mexico, also in Chile, also in Germany, also in Malaysia, in South Korea, China, and Japan. It implies that these concerns that people show or speak about, that is why we don't want to put together public banks, is because of all these dangers, all of this insecurity, all of this impracticality, all of this, it's just a theoretical idea, etc., is, for me, exceedingly puzzling, if you will. Maybe I'm naive, but here is something that can benefit the people of Colorado and the people of the United States. It is not risky. Can I have the next slide, please? Oops. Yes, I'd say in the second paragraph, public banks provide a wonderful, safe, efficient, just, and sustainable alternative, and actually also support and strengthen private community banks and credit unions and small business and local economies, where the major banks have failed to do. So unlike the Prime Minister of England, of Britain at the time, Margaret Thatcher, and her colleague, President Ronald Reagan in the United States, this idea of that there is a TINA principle at work all the time, that there is no alternative, turns out to be in my estimation, I'll use very, very strong words. It is a criminal assertion because it destroys imagination at the very, very outset. If that principle were correct, would never change anything at all, because at any given time, we already have the solution and we don't want any others, even though they have shown to be, much better. So we must find ways to establish them, these banks, for the common good now and also for the future. This is not about only this generation. This is about generations to come after us, if they're lucky enough to have an earth that is still viable and institutions that are also not only viable, but that serve them, like we have been served by our own institutions and also by this wonderful earth. Thank you.
Thank you, Alec. Appreciate it. And now we want to turn it over to Earl Staelin, who is the chair of the Rocky Mountain Public Banking Institute. Earl? And we are headed toward a question and answer period, so we hope to be with that shortly. Earl? You're muted, Earl. So many buttons, so little time. Okay.
Earl just.
There you go. There
All
you
right,
go, Earl.
there we are.
All right. Take it away.
All right. The issue was raised by some people that asked whether the Colorado Constitution allows public banks or prohibits it. And we did a lot of research, and it was done around the country, and the result is the same. And that was confirmed by a legal memorandum of the Colorado Office of Legislative Legal Services, which is the legal arm of our state legislature. They said that a state public bank operated as a Tabor enterprise, which is a self-supporting institution, is probably legal under Article 11, sections 1 through 3 of the Constitution, and the legislation could establish a state public bank. They also said that that legislation would carry a very heavy presumption of constitutionality. An opponent would have to prove unconstitutionality beyond a reasonable doubt. In a separate memo, the Office of Legislative Legal Services concluded that home rule communities could establish public banks through their own legislation directly without state legislation if they limit their operations to their own community. So we have drafted legislation of two types. One is to create a state-owned bank, and the other is to make it easier for local communities to establish their own public bank. Summarize briefly the state legislation. First of all, it's modeled on the Bank of North Dakota. It has a governing board of stakeholders and banking experts with statutory guidance to assure professional management. It makes joint loans with community banks, credit unions, and CDFIs, and some loans directly, such as student loans, as the Bank of North Dakota does. The bank will receive most state deposits. It will back all its deposits with the state's full faith and credit, which the Bank of North Dakota does and other public banks do. Its initial capital will be $20 million or more, allowing it, of course, to lend up to 10 times more than that. It will have a business relationship with the Federal Reserve. And as mentioned, it will be a Tabor enterprise, and therefore free of the Colorado Tabor Amendment restrictions on lending and expenditures, which has been a real chain around Colorado's efforts to meet some of the critical needs here. It will also lend for productible, sustainable purposes, do countercyclical lending that prevents bubbles and recessions, and it will not lend for speculation. The draft legislation for county and city-owned banks will be also modeled on the Bank of North Dakota and therefore similar. It will have a governing board of stakeholders and banking experts, again, with statutory guidance from a city or county charter or governing document. It will make joint loans, again, with community banks, credit unions, and community development financial institutions. It will receive most deposits of its government. The deposits will be backed again by the full faith and credit of the government, as opposed to having to put up very costly collateral, which does not make sense for a bank holding the assets of its own government to which it is committed. Initial capital of 20 million or more, business relationship with the Federal Reserve, which can be very helpful, as the Bank of North Dakota has. It will be a Tabor enterprise again and free of the Tabor's restrictions. And it will lend for, again, productive, sustainable purposes and countercyclical lending rather than speculation. It will be regulated by a newly formed public banking division of the State Banking Board for the reason that public banks in purpose, ownership, and lending is very different in those ways from a private bank, and it would make more sense to have it regulated separately. Also, as I mentioned, the Office of Legislative Legal Services in Colorado said that home rule communities may already have the right to create their own bank if they confine their operations to their own community, such as by lending directly to their own government or by financing its own bonds. This issue may benefit from further legal research to determine its limits. Finally, how do you start a public bank? Well, it's not really that difficult. With the initial capital of 20 million or more, it could come from the federal stimulus, which provided several $1 billion to Colorado. That would be a very small part of that. Same thing with the amount of money that went to local counties and cities. They could come up with that from the federal stimulus. An alternative that would be equally not cost anything to the local government would be revenue bonds, where the investors would provide the initial capital for the bank. And what happens with revenue bonds is that they're repaid solely from the bank's income and not by the bank itself, and it or the bank's other assets, and it would not risk the bank's capital or the government because it's paid solely from the bank's income. Additional capital could come from the Colorado Housing Finance Authority, which already has a revolving loan fund, as well as other loan funds. And I learned recently there may be a recently formed Green Bank in Colorado, which is a revolving fund, which could provide additional capital or be converted to a public bank. Also, investment pools. There's a organization in Colorado called Colorado Trust that has $9 billion in assets from 1,500 local communities. They might want to invest some of their funds in a public bank, which would be more constructive than probably some of the investments they're engaged in. Likewise, pension funds. Most pension funds, or many of them these days, are actually investing some of their funds in hedge funds, private equity, and real estate, which are potentially risky, don't benefit the local community, and are rather predatory. To invest a small portion of that in a public bank would be arguably a much better and sounder investment. And of course, it's been mentioned by several that a bank can lend up to 10 times its capital. What about initial deposits? This has been covered already, but we would merely transfer deposits from major banks to the public bank, and new tax revenue would all go or mostly go into the public bank. Some of it might go into community banks and credit unions. I know some communities prefer to do at least put some of their deposits in that source. And for initial loans, unlike a private bank, it doesn't have to search around for possibilities and drum up customers. There are many needs that are already waiting desperately to be funded. Affordable housing, clean energy, broadband, sustainable agriculture, and Michael Melio included in his wonderful video a long list of things that public banks can and would be able to fund at lower interest. So what's next? Well, we need to secure legislators as sponsors and co-sponsors. Several states, cities, and counties in the country are already well ahead. California, San Francisco, the Oakland region of several county area, New Jersey, New York, Philadelphia, Massachusetts, New Mexico, Oregon, Washington. They've all had legislation introduced, and there's more than that. Why isn't Colorado out front also? Legislators can enlist Office of Legislative Legal Service to assist with legislation. Let's educate our state and local officials, stakeholder organizations and leaders, and generate action. This calls for community and political vision, courage, and persistence. We can do it. So that concludes my talk, and I'd like to go back to Michael Melio, who wants to talk a little bit about how people can get invited and what's more on our next agenda. So Michael, take it away.
Thank you, Earl. The Rocky Mountain Public Banking Institute, together with the Colorado Public Banking Coalition, are preparing a major initiative to introduce 2 draft bills on public banking in the 2023 Colorado legislative session. We have a lot of work to do, building the grassroots support necessary to assure passage of our bills. If you would like to help in this effort, please save the chat and sign our letter of support at the coalition website. You will find a link to the coalition website in the chat. Furthermore, we will follow up with you if you sign that letter of support and send you an invitation to get involved. And please do, we really hope that you have appreciated this presentation put together by many, many talented people. And we hope that you will follow this endeavor in Colorado and wish us really good luck in this effort. So please get involved and do what you can. So look to the chat for information relevant to this. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Earl and Alec and Ellen. There's a lot of material there, as all of you saw. You heard a couple of things a couple of times, and hopefully that's sunk in about how all this is working. The urgency that we spoke of at the outset is obvious, should be obvious to all of us. The needs that we have are many and they're growing. The ability for us to pay for these things really is there, but not if we have to borrow it all from private sources, from private banks. So that's the call. Now is the time. We have about 10 minutes left, so we're really anxious to hear the questions that you might have. And I suspect that there are many. If you do have a question, on the screen under reactions, you can raise your hand, and then we'll be able to call on you and navigate them as they show up. All right.
And Walt, I might add that we also encourage people to give us advice. What is it that we've missed? What is it that you would like to hear more of, etc. So thank you very much.
Very good. Well, let's go to Kate Paradis. Hi, Kate. You're muted.
Sorry. So the question, this is actually David, Kate's partner.
Hi,
And
David.
thank you. It's been super informative. And I feel as though one thing you didn't mention, and it's small, but I think it's significant and could be a good partner in this endeavor, is the University of Colorado borrows billions and billions of dollars, and it's from private banks. And as you know, one of the biggest losers from Tabor over the last 20 to 30 years has been higher education in our state. We're, based on various statistics, somewhere between 45th and 47th in higher education funding. And I could actually see this as a way to make the University of Colorado not draw on any funds from the state of Colorado. In other words, reduce the state's liabilities to the university. If the university borrowed from the state banks, it would be able to save so much money, or the public banks would be in the state. And they seem like a key ally for you here. So I just wanted to throw that out there as a possibility. And I actually plan on bringing this up with the people I talk to in the university.
Well, that's great, David. Thank you. We'd be happy to help in any way we can with backing you up on data on that. Kimbria, do you want to ask a question, or can go to Brady?
Yeah, I wanted to, we had someone ask, can you talk about how public banks, this is Martin, public banks would appeal to conservatives, or if there are ideological barriers where the appeal fails?
So if you don't mind, I'll answer that, or at least respond to it. Now, one of the things that we found around the country doing this work is that this has a very strong resonance for true conservatives, because they are self-reliant, they are into conservation, they don't like big business and big government getting into their faces. So there's some very bottom line sort of fundamental issues that resonate with not just progressive and more liberal people, but also, of course, the conservatives as described. In fact, the Tea Party was very active at the outset, and we had several state initiatives that were begun by conservatives at that point. So, and of course, we want to remember that North Dakota itself is a very conservative state, even though they say they would probably have trouble starting the bank in its current state. They operate very conservatively and thrive as a result. Thanks, Kimbria. Braden, let's go to you.
Also, I'd like to add to what Walt said, that a public bank can much better fund small businesses, which are usually conservative in their orientation. The big banks are not good at funding small business. And a public bank creates a very sizable new source of income without raising taxes.
Right.
And it also will make loans in cooperation with community banks, local community banks that are private, and credit unions. And these also are often conservative in orientation. And as Ellen mentioned, the public banks in North Dakota have had no failures for many years. They support the public bank. They have by far the highest number of community banks in the country. And they have many credit unions. So the ability to fund local businesses is also a conservative value. So there are many reasons why this can and should appeal to conservatives, Republicans, libertarians, and independents.
Thanks, Earl. That's really, really good points. And it makes me think that we might also encourage you to check out a conversation from Eric Hardimeyer that was recorded by the California Public Banking Alliance about a month ago in talking about how the Bank of North Dakota operates with community bankers and inside their industry. Ellen referred to it when they described that their mission is to solve problems and to rush into crises to foresee and anticipate need. Thanks, Earl. Braden, let's go to you.
Yeah. Can you hear me well?
Yeah, you're on. Cool.
Awesome. I really enjoyed the presentation. It's my first deep dive into this subject. I don't have any advice. Did a really good job, everyone. My question was around if had seen some support from either some state house or state senate members already, or if this is more of a new process that is beginning.
Earl and Alec and Michael, do you want to speak to that?
We've had town hall and face-to-face meetings, mostly by Zoom in the last 2 years for obvious reasons with numerous legislators, and they all virtually find this idea is something they like. I think the only hesitation is most of them don't have extensive knowledge or background in finance. And at this particular time, this is an election year when they tend to be more reluctant to take on big issues. That's why we're focusing on next year with our legislation. In fact, the legislation session ends in several weeks here now. And with that lead time, and we have some key leaders of both the Senate and the House that have expressed interest in this, and a couple of legislators said they would sponsor it or co-sponsor it. And so we just need to further build those contacts and their commitments and heading into 2023. And our legislation is further along now than it was when we made those earlier contacts.
I'd only like to add that our campaign over the next 8 or 9 months will actually focus in large measure on city councilors, county commissioners. And we have a number of city councilors who are already interested in the idea. And we were pretty close to getting a majority in one city. And I won't give up any names yet, but we're still working at that level. We feel that if we can get some city councilors and mayors and county commissioners on board, they could make a case for us for public banking with the state legislators. Or, as Earl had pointed out in the legal memos from the Office of Legislative and Legal Services, cities and counties already do have, home rule cities and counties already have the authority they need to establish their own public banks right now. We just need to find a courageous city to do that, or a courageous county to do that.
Yeah, provided they're home rule.
Exactly.
And I would add that in addition to wanting to locate champions, elected champions, we want that the people to pull this forward, the people will need to stand together and insist on this to push it forward as well. And I'd also mention electorally in New Jersey, Governor Philip Murphy ran on creating a public bank and won 2 terms and is in the process of creating the public bank of the Garden State. Fred, we have a couple more minutes. Let's go to you, Fred Malin.
Okay, I have 2 questions actually. The first one is, are public banks FDIC insured? That's an issue in Colorado because marijuana dispensaries can't borrow money from public banks or private banks, and they can't accept credit cards because distribution of marijuana is a federal crime. I was wondering if this would be the same problem at a public bank.
Well, as we speak, Congress is voting on this issue. So we're expecting to see some change in that. FDIC insurance, by the way, is somewhat irrelevant, it seems, on a corporate level or on a community level. Even though you need to have it, it's just not going to do much to protect the money of the people. So that business with marijuana is going to be changing. And of course, it's 4/20. So we can take it today.
So you are FDIC insured?
Yeah, well, no, well, we don't think it needs to be FDIC insured. There are other ways to insure it, but at the moment, depending upon who's putting it together at the governmental level, it may or may not have to be required that way. So it would not be constrained by that.
The FDIC insurance also only covers about $250,000 per depositor. And we're talking about potentially hundreds of millions of dollars from a city, which it really doesn't even do much to insure the city's deposits. I mean, well, what are you going to insure them against? Itself? I mean, that's why we're trying to say, collateralization and these other requirements are kind of a moot point with a public bank because the depositor and the bank are the same owner.
So Fred,
the Bank of North Dakota is not FDIC insured, has never been, and it backs its deposits, which is what the insurance does, with its full faith and credit, and that's been perfectly satisfactory. Of course, it's never failed. It's never had losing years. They've been had an average return of 20% return on equity over the last 20 years. Same thing with the public bank in Alberta, Canada. They're 83 years old. They back their deposits with their full faith and credit. That makes much more sense.
So Fred,
Earl, can I ask, do you have that in your legislation? I would think it needs to be.
Yes, it's in the legislation.
Okay.
Yeah, just as it is in
Because
North
otherwise
Dakota.
it probably would be required unless you put it in the legislation. Yeah.
That's right. That's
So
right.
it's there.
And also, Fred, I mean, the contrast is to private banks who, even though they have all of this insurance, have nevertheless had to be bailed out. So if you look for insurance as something that will protect the American people's money or the Coloradan people's money, you're not going to get it by FDIC insurance if you behave really very badly and speculatively rather than conservatively and appropriately as with a public bank.
Yeah, and it's good to remember that FDIC insurance really was designed for individual person depositors. I mean, that's what its design was for, to cover your personal income and deposits.
Yeah. That's
Okay,
right.
my second question may have already been answered.
okay.
Will it take legislation in Colorado to get a public bank started here?
Yes.
Yes, well, it will take state legislation to establish a state public bank, and will, at least for a home rule city, require local legislation to establish a public bank. And for non-home rule cities and counties, it will require state legislation authorizing public banks.
Correct. Yes.
So I have kept you all a little bit longer than we said, and it's my job to bring this to a conclusion. And I want to thank you very much for attending this evening's gathering, for your time and your interest. And we certainly hope we'll have your support in action steps going forward so that we can get Colorado involved and get you guys the kind of infrastructure, financial infrastructure that can carry you into the future and serve the democratic interests of the people there. For those of you who are elected officials, we hope you've gotten some inspiration out of this. And we are here to help in any way that we can going forward. We want to thank all of the support, all the people who were helping to put tonight's event together. And for those of you who are operating the chat, Suzanne O'Keefe, Kimbria Badenhausen, Scott Baker from PBI, and on behalf of all of us, all of the organizations.
Well, before you sign off, do
Okay.
you want to remind people that they should save the chat if they want to?
Yes,
There you go. You just did it, Earl.
all right.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
So it's just the three dots to the right of the window. Click on that, click on Save Chat. As soon as you exit the meeting, a window will pop up and you'll be able to access that. And please contact PBI if you want any help with anything.
And we want to invite all of you to take advantage of our coalition calls once a month, the second Friday of every month. We do an hour-long conversation about public banking and what's going on around the country. We'd love to see you there. And you can get a registration link from the PBI website.
Yeah,
Thanks
and
so much,
it's also-
everybody.
I put it in the chat.
It's in the chat. Okay. Thanks again.
Thanks so much, Kimbria, Walt, Ellen,
Yes.
Thanks,
and
everyone.
everyone.
Yeah, and
Thanks
don't
for
forget
all
to
your
check
work.
out Ellen Brown's website and check out her books, Public Banking, The Public Banking Solution. You'll love that one.
Okay, guys.
Take care, everyone.
Good night.
Bye, bye-bye.
Good night.
Thanks for coming in.